Hello everybody, MinishCap1 here. Today is the day before Season 16 launches, and I'm going to be talking about the current state of Singed. I'm MinishCap1, I am a multi-season Challenger Singed main. I've played this character for many years, hit Challenger many times, climbed very high on the ladder. This character is my favorite character in the entire game of League of Legends. I think he is probably the most unique champ in the game, and also one of the most fun characters from my perspective. And I feel like as time has went on in the last year or so, Riot made some changes that made Singed feel very unsatisfying to play for many players of this champion. In particular, at the beginning, it was mostly high-elo players who felt it, but now as more time has passed, I've actually noticed many other players from all different elo ratings actually complaining about the current state of this character. So I will say I don't think that Singed is a weak champion. There is a difference, in my opinion, between a weak champion and an unsatisfying champion. I think that currently Singed is a very deeply unsatisfying champion, and I will explain why. So about a year ago, Riot made a change to this champion's Poison Trail ability, his Q, where it now will guarantee a last hit on a minion if it is in combat with one of your minions as it's dying, essentially allowing the ability for the poison to just last hit minions for you. So you might be asking yourself, well, MinishCap, why is it bad for poison to last hit minions? And I will say I do not think that it is inherently a bad change that poison can last hit minions. It does make the champion more accessible to newer players and lower elo players, which is totally fine. However, I do feel like Riot really missed the mark when it comes to the balancing act of Singed after the fact that they added this mechanic to his Poison Trail, and that has left Singed in a very deeply unsatisfying state. So I made a quick infographic to more quickly convey exactly the history of what has happened to this champion. So in patch 25.06, Riot added the minion last hitting mechanic to Poison Trail, and in that exact same patch, Riot nerfed Fling from 60% AP ratio down to 55%. And this is on top of the fact that this ability was already nerfed very heavily from 75% back when Predator was the meta for this champion. And then Predator was removed and this ability was never compensated. And now the ability is nerfed again due to this minion last hitting mechanic. Then in the same exact patch as a hotfix, Riot reduced the AP ratio of poison from 85% down to 80%. So these numbers, you actually have to multiply them by 8, because when you tag something with poison, you get a guaranteed 8 ticks of poison because it lasts for 2 seconds, 4 times per second, multiply the numbers by 8, right? So from 10.625 down to 10%, this was a really, really big nerf to poison. Then in the very next patch, Riot nerfed his passive Noxious Slipstream, the cooldown from 8 up to 10 seconds. That sucked. However, Riot did revert the Poison Trail nerf from 80% back to 85%, which was good. However, again in this same patch, Riot nerfed Singed's ultimate by 5 stats, minus 5 stats at all levels. Now you might be wondering, MinishCap, why is that such a big deal? It's only 5 stats. Well, Singed's level 6 ultimate now is really, really, really bad. Level 6 Singed with Ulton can actually lose fights 1v1 to supports that are level 4. Tank, Enchanter, doesn't really matter. It's pretty crazy. And this matters a lot for Void Grubs fights, because in high elo games, the enemy support will roam to Void Grubs fights while so what happens is top lane, jungle, mid lane, and support on both sides will all roam to Void Grubs, and you'll have a big fight usually over Void Grubs to see who gets them. And for these fights, Singed feels exceptionally weak, very, very weak, because the level 6 ultimate is just really nerfed. Level 2 and level 3, so level 11 and level 16 ults, losing minus 5 stats is not that big of a deal because they already had way more stats to work with. But at level 6, level 1 ult, the proportional amount of stats lost going from 30 down to 25 is so much higher than going from like 100 to 95. It's so much higher, the loss at level 6 proportionally, that you feel extremely, extremely weak at level 6 when you are ulted on this champion. And then in 25.08, Riot reverted the passive as well back to 8 seconds. So when everything was said and done with the balancing that Riot did, what have we been left with as a result? Well, Singed is a champion now that can definitely farm more effectively, sure. However, the trade-offs is that we had multiple nerfs to the champion, to his kit, to his numbers. A lot of his items got nerfed as well. Leandry's, for example, in the start of season 14 used to have 90 AP, then it had 75, then it has 60 AP, right? Which is his like main core damage dealing item, so that was nerfed heavily. Then you lose -5 on all of your stats for your ultimate, you lose ratio on fling. When all of this is said and done, we're left with a champion who is squishier, right, deals less damage than before, is slower, right, worse target access, and actually ends up having worse laning than before. When Riot released this change for Poison Trail, they stated that the goal was to actually have Singed have a better laning phase, because they know that Singe's laning phase is one of the worst in the entire game. They're aware of this. But the problem is they nerf the stats so much that the stats and the abilities so much and the items that the amount of farm that you have to get, from as a result of these changes from the last hitting on your queue is so high to make up for the amount of what we lost just in terms of our kit, right, and our stats, not even counting for items, right? We could account for items if we wanted to, but not even accounting for all the item nerfs. The insane amount that you have to farm to make up for what we have lost is so high that you feel like when you're playing this champion, you feel like you're playing catch up from the beginning of the game, even when both champions in top lane, or just in general, like every champion starts at 0, right? Or whatever the starting gold. You still feel like even with that, you're essentially just playing from behind, because there is only a finite amount of farm in the game, right? And if you can't touch the wave, you're not going to get all of that farm because you're getting zoned off the wave. And what this means is that it feels like you're playing from behind. And I understand, right, that the last hitting is a powerful tool for getting gold. But the amount that you have to farm to actually overcome the deficits of what we lost is so high that you just feel like you're playing catch up permanently for the entire game. I think this also had the added effect of making Singe's matchups more black and white. And what I mean by that is it takes the two ends of easy/hard matchup, which were already pretty extreme, and makes them even more extreme, exacerbates them even more. What do I mean by this? So imagine a matchup for Singed like Vayne or Heimerdinger, where it's very, very difficult to touch the creep wave at all. In those matchups, it's actually worse now for Singed, because even if you walk up, you're going to get obliterated anyways, and you have less armor, you have less movement speed, you have less health regen from your ultimate, you have less of everything. Everything is less, right? You have less damage on your fling. So even if you somehow manage to touch the wave in these like super hard matchups, you're gonna get obliterated harder than before. On the other side, when you're playing versus a matchup, let's say something easier like a Malphite, right? For Singed, Malphite's an armor stacking champion. Singed doesn't really deal physical damage, so it's a very good matchup for Singed. When you play versus a champion like that, it feels completely brain dead. Like you might as well be on autopilot sometimes, is what it feels like when you play versus an easier matchup, because it almost feels like it plays itself. It's takes the easier matchups and makes them way easier, and it takes the harder matchups, and the majority of Singed matchups are probably on the harder side for him because his laning phase is very weak. It makes those matchups so much worse than what it was before, which is very ironic to me, because Riot's stated goal with this change was to improve Singe's laning phase, but then they quote-unquote improved his laning phase by nerfing all of your stats and your abilities, your durability, movement speed, everything. It's weird, right? And like I said earlier, in exchange for all of this, we got the ability to last hit with Q on minions, but this is assuming that, like, again, you can even touch the wave at all, and this is assuming that you are in a position in the game where that's even going to matter, because like I said earlier, again, it feels like you're playing from behind with all of the stats that we lost through nerfs to the kit, the champion, the stats, items, everything, right? So I will say that I do think that Season 16 will address a little bit of this. at least in terms of Singe's scaling, because currently it feels like Singed has no early game, but he also doesn't really have a late game, because you have to buy a lot of tank items on this character to even function currently with the absurd amount of damage in the meta. I think that this will improve a bit in Season 16 because Otacon is being removed, Flowers are being removed, which means a lot of damage is being removed from the game, which is good for Singed. However, I don't think it's going to fix the core issues that this change has caused, where it is probably a good change overall for the champ to have last hitting on minions with poison. However, the result of that, again, is that he's left in a very unsatisfying state. So let me pose to you a question, right? After I showed you a clip from Riot August where I spoke to him about this. So here's the question that I asked Riot August on his stream, and I will go over his response afterwards, because I do think that it was a pretty good response. So I said, hello August, I feel like Singed has become low elo skewed since minion execution was added to queue and is not satisfying in Grandmaster Plus. I think this will only become worse in Season 16 with level 16 coming faster. His win rate used to scale up with elo, but now it scales down, which is true. Singed used to be a champion where in lower elos, like your iron, bronze, silver, these elos, he would actually have a pretty average win rate, and then as you got higher elo, his win rate would improve. And I think overall it doesn't have to be that way, but I think now, because the opposite is true, where Singe's win rate is actually highest in iron and bronze and then goes down as you get higher, I think with that being the case, it also shows that there's probably a problem with his current state, and that there is most likely, in my opinion, a space in between where we can meet in the middle, where it's not so completely skewed to one side. Sorry if the audio on this clip is a bit low. I have boosted the volume to above maximum.
Minish Cap, I don't know the details of Singe. Thanks for the 2 years, by the way. I can tell you, though, that it is not a design desire to make most characters super high elo skewed. And so if the complaint is Singe is better for low MMR players now, that's not necessarily a mark against him, or a mark for him, for what it's worth. It's generally a good thing when the average player can succeed at a champion, especially for a character like Singed, who tends to be fairly inaccessible to begin with. Now, if it's impossible to succeed with him at higher MMRs, maybe there's some changes that could be made here, right? But just kind of noting that, like, it's not a typical design practice to be like, this character needs to be super high MMR skewed. That tends to be really rough for most characters who are like that, unless they like really communicate the fantasy, like a Lee Sin or a Kali or something like that.
So I do think that he makes a good point here, that it's probably not okay for most champions to be super highly skewed and to have them be accessible for lower rated populations of players, right? Totally fine. He actually addresses it directly. He even August is a very smart game designer, I think, in my opinion. He's one of the many writers who does do a very great job. But he says specifically in this response immediately that he is wondering if Singe is feeling bad in high MMR games, that is something that they can address specifically and not tank him for everybody else that is not a high elo player, right?
And yeah, in regards to his Q minion execute, the reason that's there is just make him a better feeling character, right? Like, if you're like, he's not satisfying, I would argue the reason he's not satisfying is not because his Q executes minions. It would be because he has other issues on his kit that make him unsatisfying.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mentioned like the bare minimum of the issue, and August like very intuitively understands that there's probably other things going on that makes him very unsatisfying, such as the multitude of nerfs to his kit, the fact that it feels like you're always playing from behind, etc.
It's actually pretty valuable for a character like Singe to have a little bit of execute on a spell like Q, so it doesn't feel like his dot is trolling him when he's trying to last hit. And
yeah,
I know, like,
I agree.
You are a challenger level player, and so you might not mind stuff like that. You're like, well, I can just last it anyways. But like, you'd be surprised at how many players will like just churn off a champion just because like their last hitting feels awkward.
Yeah, this is actually a complaint that I had originally about this change, is that I as a player already farmed very, very well on this champion, so it felt like this change didn't really help me at all. And it was only specifically a nerf, which I think is still true. It very specifically nerfed higher elo Singe players, where my CS per minute went from like 8.0 to like 8.3 or something like that, and in return for getting an extra 0.3 minions per minute, I am getting this multitude of nerfs to my kit, like it does feel pretty bad, and I'm glad that Riot August understands that. So in the rest of that clip, August essentially, after another response from me, he goes on to ponder if it is possible that Singed, in order to feel satisfying for all levels of players, might need to just be a 54% win rate champion. If that might need to just be his baseline level of power for him to be considered satisfying for all players that play him, right? And he does have a fair point there. I think it is possible, right, that Singed needs to just maybe sit at 54% win rate Emerald Plus for him to feel good for, you know, high elo players and also low elo players, while not feeling like you're always playing from behind, which is what it feels like right now, in my opinion, that you're always playing from behind, always playing catch up from minute 0, right? And I could see his point there, right? Maybe we do need Singed to be a 54% win rate champion for him to be satisfying for all players. My only concern is that, like, how do you communicate that to your average player who's going to go on Reddit and then make a post about, oh, I can't believe Singed is just 54% all the time. Wow, he's so overpowered, even if 54% is actually balanced for Singed. They did the same thing with Bard, by the way. They actually did exactly this with Bard, where Riot acknowledged that Bard was already OP at like 52%. And then they said, we don't care, we're going to buff him anyways. Freak actually said exactly that in his patch rundown. They buffed him again to like 53%, and then they're just like, this is where Bard is now. He's a 53% win rate champion. You know, you can deal with it if you don't like it, but this is where we think that Bard needs to be in order to succeed. Which, in my opinion, like, that's fair, right? So we have seen this before with other champions, and that's my most recent example, where they're just gonna say, yeah, this champ gets to be super high win rate, and that's okay for the character. And they could go that route with Singed as well. I do find it to be a little bit heavy-handed personally, but maybe they can make it work, right? Who knows? That being said, I don't think that Riot is ever going to remove the Poison Trail minion execution or minion last hit. Unfortunately, as much as I wish that was the case, as much as I would personally enjoy that, I don't think that they're going to. And I think for the majority of players, including lower elo players, that is probably going to be the case, where they won't remove it. I do want to highlight some statistics and some hypotheticals, though, to you. So for the argument about accessibility, I do find it very interesting when you look at the actual pick rate history of this champion. So around the time that this patch dropped, which was about late March, early April, when they added the minion last hitting mechanic, Singed pick rate, his popularity, went up from about 2% to a little under 4%. So it almost doubled. However, you can see immediately after that, when the nerfs started happening, his pick rate then started to decline back down to 2%, actually going under where it was before for a little bit, before it again evens out back to about 2% after that. So then my question about this is, and I don't have an answer for this. I do have an opinion, but not an answer. So my question about this is that if his pick rate is the exact same now as it was before the change to his poison, which was meant to allow him to be more accessible and have a better laning phase, if his pick rate is now the exact same as it was before, after it went up and then back down due to the nerfs, you didn't actually, Riot didn't actually achieve their goal of making him more accessible, did they? Because when you make the champion's farming easier, but then you make subsequently all of his gameplay harder by nerfing the kit, you kind of end up at like a net neutral, right? Or am I wrong? What do you guys think about this? And here's another question that I hope you guys can answer for me, or at least just have an opinion on, because I also have opinions on this. But there are other dot champions in the game, which means damage over time, that don't actually have minion last hitting built into their kit, but Singed does. So the best examples I can think of this are going to be Brand, Zyra, and Teemo. These champions all deal damage primarily through damage over time as well, but they don't actually have last hitting built into their kit, and as a result, their entirety of their kits have not been nerfed as a result, right? Now, the counterpoint to this is obviously that those champions have other abilities that deal damage besides just their damage over time ability, besides just their poison or their burn or whatever, right? Whereas Singed only has fling besides his poison for damage. So there is an argument to be made there. But I do think, in my opinion, if Riot was to add last hitting into those champions' kits, and then subsequently nerf every single aspect of those champions kits, like what has been done to Singed, I think that the people who play those champions would be very, very deeply unsatisfied, right? Because like Singed players, they put in the time to learn how to last hit with a mechanic such as damage over time, where, you know, originally it never guaranteed last hitting on minions, right? That was a benefit and a con, a pro and a con to picking a damage over time oriented champion, is that you have a very consistent DPS application tool that normal AP champions like control mages, whatever, don't have access to. In exchange for that, you had to learn how to last hit because your DPS was going to be consistently coming out, and you can't actually time it once you put it on to something unless you learn the timing of the damage application, right? So there is a lot of skill to it that I think just to last hitting that just gets removed straight up from the champion, that I think other players of other damage over time champions would be very, very unsatisfied with if their kits were to change to accommodate for something like this as well, right? And a much more different champion than Singed, we could theorize, just a hypothetical right here. What if a champion like Riven, or maybe a champion like Diana, was given the ability to guarantee last hit minions with their Q, their main damage ability? Well, then Riot would have to absolutely nerf those champions into the dirt to compensate for that, and then the players who play those champions would be very, very upset, in my opinion. Now, obviously, that's a very hypothetical situation because those champions are very different from Singed and how they play and the mechanics of those champions. But I'm just arguing, like, in theory, right? If this was the case for those champions, if that did happen, do you think that those players of those champions would be very, very upset? I think they would be, right? And so I think that there is some validity to high elo Singed players' frustrations with the state of the champion currently. And I do feel like the larger Singed player base as a whole is slowly starting to understand this as they've played more and more games with the minion changes, that I'm starting to see more comments where people are thinking like, hey, you know, I've climbed, but I've hit this plateau. I can't seem to get past it. Wow, the champion now all of a sudden feels very, very underwhelming, feels very unsatisfying. Like, I wish that there was more that he had in order to, you know, do things, but it just feels like that the champion's not capable of things that he used to be, which I think is very valid because it's true. It's literally true, right? Singed at a cap is straight up weaker than what he used to be, because of these changes to his farming, right? Like, once you hit 6 items, you are just weaker than before. And like I said earlier, again, because it feels like you're playing from behind at the start of every game, you're gonna feel like that the entire time a lot of the time, which does suck, you know what I mean? So at the start of the video, I did mention that I think Season 16 will be better for Singed overall, and while it's not gonna solve all of the problems that are popping up with him right now because of the minion lasting changes, I do think that there are some things that will be a lot better that will make him feel a lot better to play. So, Otacon and Flowers are being removed. Now, Singed is a champion that is notoriously bad at fighting around Otacon because you have the 4 Otacon walls, then you have the lane wall on the bottom and the lane wall on the top. Then oftentimes you also have the Dragon Pit wall to worry about as well. So there's a ton of walls to fight around with the Otacon, where Singed is not able to really maneuver that well around those walls unless he has Flash, and even then you can only go over 1. So as a result, you've seen champions like Talon, Kiana, Nefiri, Zed, characters that can go over walls over and over and over, succeed a lot this year due to the Otacon changes. I also think that with the Flowers being removed from Otacon, that this will be better as well for Singed, because the Flowers added a lot of damage to the game. If the winning team got Otacon, they would get like 35 Flowers minimum. Sometimes they get up to like 60 Flowers, so they get like anywhere from 25 to like 40 adaptive force, ability power, AD from the Flowers alone, which is insane. And then you multiply that by 5, by the way, including the fact that they got like 1,000 experience to level up with faster, and then multiply that by 5 as well. There was just so much damage that was amped into the game that it felt like there was no way to survive a lot of these fights, because like I said before, it feels like you are playing from behind at the start of the game, right? So I do feel like with those things being removed, that Singed will feel better. I also think that the new items, Protoplasm Harness and Vandal Pipes for top lane and, you know, other non-top lane playstyles, but specifically Protoplasm Harness being so good for Singed, I think will be a good thing as well overall. So I'm excited about that. I think that top lane being a stronger role in Season 16 with the role quest, with the free teleport, will be a lot better for Singed as well, because Singed obviously likes to have Ghost Flash or Ignite Ghost, so I think these will be good for him. So season 16 overall will, in my opinion, be a lot better for Singed than 15, but it's not going to address like the core issues of what's happening here with the minion last hitting changes, which is why I do think that what August said is very compelling. But yeah, those are my thoughts currently. I do think that season 16 will be a lot better for Singed. And I hope that you guys have a very good season 16 as well. I have a much more positive outlook on this upcoming season that starts tomorrow compared to currently, because man, season 15 was not it for League in my opinion, and they really felt like they put the game on the back burner for season 15, and it feels like season 16 is the complete opposite, where they are really paying attention to League again, and they're making League like their big focus, which is good. And I'm very happy about that. So that being said, guys, leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think about this. And I will catch you guys in the upcoming season 16 videos. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate all of you guys. You guys are awesome. And I will see you later. Outro clip. Slowly fade out.